This video is going to provide some really important terminology for the design of an experiment. It's also going to begin to show you how you can diagram an experiment. We'll go over the simplest case in the video, which is called a completely randomized design, but we're going to cover the more complicated designs in class. Here's the example that we're going to work with throughout the video. A researcher wants to know if texting while driving has an impact on the amount of time it takes drivers to stop their cars. She randomly samples 20 people to take part in this study, where participants use a driving simulator. They're not actually driving a physical car. Each is randomly assigned to drive either with no distraction or while texting. The amount of time it takes for the driver to apply the brakes after the car in front of them on the screen applies the brakes is measured. Our ultimate goal here is to identify the different parts of this experiment and diagram it. If you recall from last class, an experiment is a method of data collection where subjects are randomly selected to take part in a study, and they're then randomly divided into separate groups. Experimental units are the individuals on which the experiment is being performed. If the individuals in the experiment are people, then the experimental units are called subjects. Now, keep in mind that an experiment differs from direct observation because the researcher has a direct role in telling the subjects or telling the experimental units what they're going to be doing throughout the course of the experiment. The first question that I want to answer is what makes this particular study an experiment? In this study, the participants are being randomly selected, and then they're randomly assigned to a driving situation. They don't get to choose if they're texting or just driving normally behind the wheel. The researcher is telling them what they're going to be doing in this driving simulator. Next, I want to know what are the experimental units. Experimental units are the individuals that are involved in an experiment. So in this case, the experimental units are the 20 people who were selected to take part in this study. Because the participants are people in this experiment, we're going to call them subjects. In an experiment, there are two types of variables. The goal of an experiment is to study the relationship between these variables. First of all, we have a response variable. A response variable is the variable of interest in an experiment. It's basically what the researchers are interested in measuring. The response variable is the variable that researchers are concerned about under various conditions. The other type of variable that we have is an explanatory variable. And an explanatory variable is any factor that may influence a response variable. Researchers choose an explanatory variable to study how it affects the response variable. What we need to do now is identify the response and explanatory variables. We really have two different things that are going on in this experiment. We're measuring how long it takes the subjects to apply the brakes, and they're doing this under two different conditions, texting and not texting. Since the response variable is the variable that researchers are interested in measuring, our response variable is the amount of time needed to apply the brakes. Since texting while driving can influence the response variable, the condition under which participants drive the simulator is the explanatory variable. We're not measuring anything here with the explanatory variable. We're just using texting or not texting to help determine if a driver's reaction time, or the response variable, is affected. Here's some more terminology regarding experiments. A treatment is any value of an explanatory variable that's imposed by researchers in an experiment. It's basically how the subjects are told to act or what they're told to do by the researchers throughout the duration of an experiment. A control is a specific treatment in an experiment that acts as the baseline where nothing is altered. Subjects are not exposed to any type of a change from their typical lifestyle. They basically act normally so that researchers can compare some other treatment or some other change with how subjects would act under completely normal conditions. A placebo is a specific name for a control that's used in medical studies. Taking a look at our study, let's identify how many treatments there are and what they are. So in this case, there are exactly 2 treatments. One of our treatments is driving with no distractions or driving normally. The other treatment that we have is driving while texting. Next, we want to know if there's a control, and if so, what it is. The control group is the group that's been told there will be no alterations to their driving. This makes the drivers who drove with no distraction the control group. Note that driving while texting is just another treatment. Both of these are treatments, but the drivers who drove with no distraction is specifically given the name the control group. The group that was driving while texting is not a control because they had an added distraction that caused them to drive under atypical circumstances. At this point, I want to show you how we can diagram an experiment. The design of an experiment consists of several parts. First of all, we need a description of the response variable and the treatments in the explanatory variable. We need to know how subjects are going to be assigned to different treatments, and we need to know how data is going to be collected. There are also several different types of experiments. For this video, I'm going to focus on the completely randomized design, which is the simplest case. There are also 3 other types that we're going to focus on in class. These are the matched pairs design, the block design, and the double-blind design. A completely randomized design is an experimental design where subjects are randomly assigned to different pre-specified treatments. In a completely randomized design, the responses are averaged for each of the different treatment groups that we have, and the average of the treatment groups are then compared to one another to see if there's any type of a difference in the means. Let's finish things off by diagramming the experiment. What we have is an example of a completely randomized design. The response variable is the reaction time for braking. Our 2 treatments are driving normally and driving while texting. And we have 20 subjects who are being randomly assigned to one of the treatment groups. This is what makes our study a completely randomized design. The subjects are being recruited, and they're then told what they're going to be doing behind the wheel. In order to diagram the experiment, we always start out by sampling the subjects. In a completely randomized design, our next step is to perform the random assignment. This can be done in several different ways. I'll show you an example in class of how this can be done, even using something as simple as Excel. In the random assignment, for this case, 10 people are going to be randomly assigned to group 1, and the other 10 people are randomly assigned to group 2. We want the sample sizes in each group to be the same. The people in group 1 are then assigned to drive with no distraction, while the people in group 2 are told to text while behind the wheel of the simulator. In the end, once everyone is done with the experiment, we take a look at the average reaction time for the drivers with no distraction and compare it to the average reaction time for the texting drivers. This will allow us to make an appropriate comparison, and it will help us determine if texting while driving leads to an increase in reaction time. This finishes off the diagram of this particular experiment. I'll show you a couple other designs that we're going to do in class, and later on in the course, we'll actually see some inferential techniques that will allow us to compare the averages in the 2 groups using numerical measures.